Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the California Department of Justice Demystifying the DOJ presentation. My name is Maheen Ahmed. I am the Deputy Director for the Office of Community Awareness, Response and Engagement, also known as CARE. I will be your moderator for this next hour that we'll be spending together. So before we begin with the presentation, I would like to share a little bit about our Office of CARE. Our office was launched in July of 2021, and our goals are to build relationships with California's communities, focusing on those who've been historically marginalized and underrepresented. We also work directly to meet the needs of California's communities, particularly those, like I mentioned, that have been marginalized. We want to ensure that DOJ's policies and programs are directly informed by all Californians. And our final goal is to make sure that we develop knowledge and awareness among the public and communities of the DOJ's mission and the actions that we are taking on behalf of California. And so in that vein, we launched this series, Demystifying the DOJ. Through these quarterly presentations, we are aiming to develop knowledge and awareness of what the DOJ does, our resources, programs, and these presentations are really opportunities for you to learn directly from DOJ staff and to ask questions regarding the work that we do in the various divisions, sections, bureaus, and offices that we have. So today is our second presentation in this series, and we'll be covering hate crime. We'll share information on what constitutes a hate crime, the responsibilities of the California Department of Justice regarding hate crime incidents, as well as findings and statistical highlights from our recently released annual 2021 Hate Crimes Report. So over the next hour, we'll hear from two of our Special Assistant Attorneys General, our top policy advisors for Attorney General Bonta, Damon Brown and Michael Redding, as well as the Program Manager for the DOJ Criminal Justice Statistics Center, Allison Lunetta. So after their respective presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. Please do look at the Q&A box that should be on your screen and share your questions so that we can collect them and answer them after the presentations. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please specify in your question. If you also shared questions in the registration form, they've been shared with our presenters, and we're hoping to have most of them addressed in the presentation. So thank you so much for sending those ahead of time. Lastly, if you're joining us today as a reporter or affiliated with the press, please identify your news outlet if you're asking a question in the Q&A box. Now to introduce our first two presenters, we will have Special Assistant Attorneys General Damon Brown and Michael Redding. Damon and Michael, please take it away.
Thank you, Maheen, and good morning to all of the attendees who are tuned in to today's presentation. Michael and I are happy to be here to talk about the work that the Department of Justice is doing to eradicate hate in our state and to protect Californians from violence and threats of violence based on their perceived protected characteristics. If we could go to the next slide, please. When Attorney General Bonta first took office last year, he immediately began to tackle this issue of hate as it resonates very personally with him, and he also sees the eradication of hate as his charge by virtue of his office as the people's lawyer for the state of California. And so one of the first quotes that he issued to commemorate his commitment to eradicating hate is displayed here on this slide, where he stated, "Throughout California's history, too many of us have felt the sting of hate and discrimination. Too many Asian, Latino, Black, Native American, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh Californians all across the state are hurting. It's going to take all of us working together to take on bias and hate and their toxic effects on our society." And so a lot of the work that we're doing in the Department of Justice is geared towards this goal, to make sure that all functions of the Department of Justice are working together to work with community-based organizations and law enforcement to make sure that Californians are protected. Next slide, please. And so the first thing that I'm going to explain a little bit is the rights that individuals have and as a civil right in California to be free from violence and the intimidation of violence based on their actual or perceived protected category. And so this first slide shows the Ralph Act, which is codified as Civil Code Section 51.7, which establishes that right to be free of violence and the threat of intimidation or violence based on the enumerated listing that you see here. These are just examples. There are other bases that are possible and some that are also expansive. We know that California law has been interpreted where protection on the basis of sex includes those who are transgender, and we want this to be a more expansive list than a prescribed list of specific examples. The bottom line is that based on your protected status, you do have the right to be free from violence. Next slide, please. Because of is a term that has been defined differently in different contexts. In the criminal context, the bias motivation must be a substantial factor in as to why the crime was committed. Civilly, there is not a definitive answer on that. There are different views and different interpretations. One similar to the criminal standard, and the other being just a motivating factor. But again, these are crimes or acts that are committed and that are either motivated or substantially motivated by their bias against one of these perceived categories. Next slide, please. Part of what the law provides a private right of action civilly for those who are the victims of hate crimes, and our office also wants to support victims of hate crimes through the provision of resources and information. Michael will talk a little bit about some of the victim services information that our office has issued. But individual citizens, as well as the Department of Fair Employment and Housing and the Attorney General's office, can sue perpetrators of these acts civilly under Civil Code Section 52 and 52.1. And again, the standard is here. Any person may sue anyone who interferes with a right secured by the federal or state constitution, which includes hate crimes. And these are the various remedies that are available to individuals who pursue these lawsuits. Injunctive relief, equitable relief, actual damages, if there are any medical bills associated with any of the acts of violence that were committed, or other damages where there was financial loss, that is also recoverable under this provision. There's also exemplary and punitive damages available, as well as a civil penalty of $25,000 plus attorney's fees. And I think that sort of the robust remedy structure under this civil code, again, is reflective of the values in California that hate crimes will not be tolerated, and the legislature has provided a robust remedy for that. Next slide. At this point, I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Redding, to talk about hate crime events.
Great. Good morning. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm Michael Redding. And yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about hate crime events, hate crimes, hate incidents. So when we say hate crime event, what we mean is that many crimes are victim specific. So for example, robbery is a crime that most people are familiar with. If somebody goes into a store and robs the two people that are behind the counter. That is one event, the robbery, but because there are two people behind the counter who experienced it and were in fear for their safety, there are two different crimes. That person, the perpetrator, can be charged with two different robbery counts. And hate crimes are a lot like that. So when we talk about a hate crime event, we're talking about the overall framework or the overall event. But within that, there can be multiple actual crimes and multiple incidents. And I'm going to talk about the difference between hate crimes and hate incidents in a minute. But in general, that's the idea, that there can be many different things. So it can be a hate crime, as it says under Penal Code Section 422.55. It can be multiple offense acts that include bias motivation. So that means many different crimes that are based on a bias against a group or the perceived belonging to a group. And then when we say that one hate crime report may include 10 offenses, almost 1,000 victims, or 99 suspects, what we mean is, and Allison will talk a little bit more about this later, is that for each hate event, police are going to come out, take a report, and the information that they convey to the Department of Justice can include up to 999 victims, 99 suspects. So when we see at our level, there's one hate crime event, that might include multiple hate crimes that were or could have been charged in that hate crime event. So all that is to say, this is a little bit of the nuance in the data that we collect. Could I go to the next slide, please? So hate crimes versus hate incidents. That's one of the biggest questions that comes up here. The short version is that hate crimes are things that are against the law. Hate incidents are often disgusting, vile, the type of behavior that certainly no one wants to support, but not necessarily a violation of criminal statutes. So a hate crime is a crime against a person, a group, or property, and the key is that it's motivated by the victim's real or perceived protected social group, meaning a hate crime is perpetrated because somebody belongs to a group or because the perpetrator thinks that person belongs to a group. So even if that person is wrong and thinks that this person is black and that person is not black, that can still be a hate crime because the perpetrator is motivated by hate. So those protected categories of hate crimes include disability, gender, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or association with a person or group with one or more of these actual or perceived characteristics, meaning you can belong to multiple groups, and as long as the crime is motivated by your actual or perceived belonging to that group, it's still a hate crime. By contrast, and hate crimes are crimes. When we say crime, that means generally that it's something that can be punished by time in jail or time in prison. By contrast, a hate incident is action or behavior motivated by hate, but is not a crime. And what we talk about a lot is that there's a lot of conduct that is protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment obviously has, very good for any number of reasons, but can also protect speech that certainly we don't care for. Name calling, insults, displaying hateful material on someone's own property, posting hate material that doesn't result in property damage, or distribution of materials with hate messages in public places. So those are all examples of the type of behavior that are hate incidents. They are motivated by hate, but they are not necessarily violations of the Penal Code statutes. Could I go to the next slide, please? Now I'm going to talk through just two examples of hate crimes. The first is a hate crime that is on its own a crime, and the second is what's called an enhancement, when there's another charge, another crime, and a hate crime enhancement can be layered on top of it. So this first one is an example of what I would call a standalone crime, and that's interference with civil right by a threat. This is a misdemeanor. It's prohibited by Penal Code Section 422.6. subsections A and C, the elements of it. So every crime has a series of elements. As a prosecutor, I need to prove these elements, and each one and every one of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. So the elements of interference with a civil right by threat are that the defendant intended to and did threaten physical violence against a person or group. That threat caused fear. The purpose of the threat was to interfere with the victim's legally protected right or privilege. And finally, that threat was made to cause fear because of the victim's actual or perceived disability, gender, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or association with a group or one or more of these characteristics. And so what that means is there are certain protected civil rights. For example, the right to vote is one of our most valued civil rights. Threatening somebody to interfere with their voting would be or could be a violation of this. And so the example would be going up to a person who belongs to a group and the perpetrator yells out something to the effect of a threat. If you vote here, I'm going to do X. I'm going to commit violence against you. I don't believe that anybody who looks like you or belongs to your group should be voting. And that would be a fairly clear violation. You'd be making a threat, you'd be intending to cause fear, and it would be because of that person's belonging to a group, and it would interfere with a person's civil right. It would have the effect or could have the effect of making that person less likely to exercise the civil right to vote. Okay, go to the next slide. And then the next example is, like I said, a hate crime allegation. So this would be sometimes you can be charged with one crime and there's an allegation on top of it. A very classic example is you commit a robbery, that's its own crime. If you commit a robbery with a gun, that can be an enhancement that you used or that person used a firearm in the course of the crime. So here, this would be another crime that was committed all on its own, meaning it was committed without regard to the motivation, but then a prosecutor would allege that it was perpetrated because of, again, the victim's actual or perceived belonging to a specific group. So here, the special allegation of a hate crime allegation is added onto a felony. And jumping to the end, it can add 1, 2, or 3 years for a prison sentence. There's another example where it could add more time. It's alleged when a defendant committed a crime because of the victim's actual or perceived, again, belonging to this group. And the elements, there's just 2 elements. First, the defendant was biased against the victim based on the victim's actual or perceived belonging to this group. And this bias motivated the defendant to commit the underlying felony. So a very clear example would be criminal threats. It is a crime to threaten somebody and cause immediate fear in that person. If a prosecutor could prove that this threat was made because the perpetrator believed that that person belonged to a group and did it because of that perceived belonging to the group, that could be an enhancement that would be added or could be added to a crime. And again, the key here is that all of these things would need to be proved in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is admittedly very difficult in some of these cases. This is what we would call a specific intent crime, meaning there's general intent crimes and specific intent. General intent can be, I'm swinging my fist, I'm intending to swing my fist, I'm not necessarily intending to hit somebody, whereas a specific intent crime would be, I'm specifically intending to hit somebody and to bring about pain in that person. So here, this would be a very specific intent crime. You have to be able to prove that this person committed the crime because of the other person's, again, belonging or perceived belonging to that group. Next slide, please. And then stepping back for a moment, the Department of Justice's role in the fight against hate. So, big picture, the department does a number of what I would call originating prosecutions, meaning that we're filing charges. But in general, that's for the most part dealt with by the 58 district attorneys in the 58 different counties in California. They're filing the vast majority of crimes. There's also the federal government, but the vast majority of crimes are charged by the DAs. So the Department of Justice role in this is really one step removed in a lot of incidences. Sometimes we can charge individual crimes, but more often we're involved in sort of the high level looking at what's going on, trying to provide resources for prosecutors, trying to provide guidance. So we provide oversight of law enforcement agency, meaning police. We do data collection, which Allison will talk about. That's through Open Justice, which is our public-facing data portal, and CYBERS, the California Incident-Based Reporting System. That's how those crimes that we talked about before get communicated to the Department of Justice, and we collect that information. We put out an annual hate crimes report about the state of hate in California. The Attorney General has been going around the state doing effectively listening sessions, the hate crimes roundtables, talking about the rise in hate and how to address it. We issue law enforcement bulletins, which are guidance to law enforcement, prosecutors' guidance, resources for victims, and hate crimes brochures in various languages. Those are all efforts to try and reach the people who are dealing with this day to day, be it victim or law enforcement. The Attorney General also created a hate crimes coordinator role at the department, who is somebody in the prosecuting section who is becoming a specialist or is a specialist in hate crimes prosecution. And then finally, the Racial Justice Bureau. And I'll turn it back over to Damon to talk more about that.
All right, thanks, Michael. The Racial Justice Bureau is a division within the Civil Rights Enforcement section at the Department of Justice. And this is something that Attorney General Bonta created within his first 100 days in office. And what the Racial Justice Bureau does is it's a coordinating mechanism for pursuing racial justice across all of the work that we're doing. The Civil Rights Enforcement section often handles systemic civil rights enforcement through investigations of entities, including local government actors and companies, law enforcement, and the implementation of stipulated judgments obtained through various negotiations, which can compel a wrongdoing entity to engage in some active form of reform, and to make changes that are then subject to oversight by either the Department of Justice or an independent monitor. And so the Racial Justice Bureau now exists within the Civil Rights Enforcement section, and it ensures that all of the work of that section is handled through a racial justice lens. And so if we can go to the next slide. Oh, you're already there. I'm sorry, you can go back one more. And so this also has resulted in an increase in capacity for the Department of Justice to take on a lot of these issues, including addressing hate crimes, and to make sure that there is a place specifically within DOJ that's focused on what we can do to protect communities and to strengthen enforcement in this area. Next slide, please. And so, again, we talked about the hate crimes portion of the Racial Justice Mandate, Racial Justice Bureau mandate, and also looking at the insidious effects of white supremacy and hate organizations within society, working with offices like CARE, where Maheen discussed earlier some of the things that they're working on to increase outreach with community organizations, to increase reporting. A lot of the data that Allison will go into later is based on data and information that has been reported, but we do know that hate crimes are underreported significantly. And so we do want to work with communities so that they have access to information, at which we're hoping can then result in better prevention and reporting. And then we also address implicit and explicit bias in policing through the investigations that we launch and try to establish better trust between law enforcement and the communities. Next slide, please. As Michael indicated earlier, our office does issue guidance to law enforcement and prosecutors to assist them in being able to better provide for public safety and to protect citizens in the communities in which they serve. We also are working on campus climate issues. We know that hate crimes can also impact students while they're away at school, in college and higher education, as well as on the elementary and high school levels. And so we do conduct investigations that address discriminatory policies and work with schools and school boards to find ways to make school environments more inclusive. And then lastly, we are also, through the Racial Justice Bureau, supporting the work that's being done by the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. And the work that's being done by that task force is unearthing various gaps in justice that will require future action for our office. And we're actively engaged in working with them to find solutions as well. So that pretty much covers the Racial Justice Bureau and the ways in which DOJ is currently acting to fight against hate. I would then like to turn it over to Allison Lunetta to talk about some of the data and the hate crimes report. Allison.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison, and I'm the program manager of the Criminal Justice Statistics Center. We're going to talk a little bit about hate crime reporting, what it is, and what the statistics were for 2021. Next slide, please. First thing we're going to talk about is what hate crime statistical reporting is, and then we're going to go into what DOJ's role in hate crime reporting is, what the 2021 statistics look like, and then give a brief overview of what open justice is. Next slide, please. In order for a hate crime to be reported under the statistical format, it needs to contain two elements. There needs to be a criminal act or an attempted criminal act, such as murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, destruction, damage, vandalism, arson, simple assault, intimidation. And there must also be a biased motivation against a protected characteristic as defined in statute. Next slide, please. What we call bias is the bias is the motivation behind the hate crime that has occurred. And this is a preformed negative opinion or attitude of a particular person, group, or entity that is based on a protected characteristic. So attitudes could include anything like resentment, contempt, hatred, animosity, paranoia, callousness, social dominance, a desire for social bonding with one's own kind. Next slide, please. And DOJ's responsibilities within hate crime reporting. By statute, we are to work with law enforcement agencies to collect and review hate crime data on a monthly basis. We compile hate crime data and submit that to the FBI. And we publish the annual report, Hate Crime in California, and also provide the data file behind the publication. Next slide, please. To go a little bit more into our responsibilities, we collect and review the actual incident reports of crime to determine if the incident was identified and reported correctly. We do this for a few reasons. We want to make sure that the information that's coming into us is accurate, and we also want to make sure that law enforcement understands how to report the statistics to us. We review each submission for accuracy and completeness, and we ensure data integrity of those hate crime submissions by running quality control checks. We look for anomalies. We research those with the law enforcement agency. We also provide review feedback. We do hands-on training. We ask follow-up questions and assist in their review and resubmissions of the data if we do find something that was incorrect. And we also provide training. We go over law enforcement's responsibilities per statute, the reporting timeframes, hate crime identification and determination, and most of this is done through scenario-based training. Next slide, please. We also compile and publish the data in our annual report or interactive dashboards. We have context documents, downloadable files, and also some special reports from time to time. Next slide, please. Something to keep in mind when we're looking at the statistics is that there are some things that do not qualify for the hate crime statistics reporting, and those are acts of discrimination, hate incidents that don't rise to the level of crime, and hate speech. You will not find counts of those in the statistics that we'll be presenting. Next slide, please. In terms of bias motivation, those are also specified in statute as we went over before, but not all kinds of biases are reportable. For example, biases against financial status like wealthy or poor, the elderly, people who dress differently, smokers, drinkers, people who may be underweight or overweight. These are not bias that are reported as hate crime statistics. Next slide, please. So to keep in mind, here are a couple of hate crime caveats when we're looking at the data. There must be a criminal act. The crime must be bias motivated. That bias comes from the offender. And the victim does not have to possess the characteristics behind the offender's bias. This means that the victim does not need to be whatever category the offender is biased against. And the victim should report the crime. So one of the caveats here is we can only report out what is reported to law enforcement. And as Michael and Damon mentioned before, we do know that there is underreporting in the communities. Next slide, please. This is what the hate crime publication in 2021 looks like. Next slide, please. It's important to note that hate crime data fluctuates from year to year and over time, and sometimes there are high years and sometimes there are low years. 2021 was one of the high years. Over the last 10 years, reported hate crimes have increased by 89.6%. The lowest year for reported hate crime events was in 2014 with 758 events. Reported hate crimes events have increased 32.6% from 1330 in 2020 to 1763 in 2021. Reported hate crime offenses increased 42.1% from 1563 in 2020 to 2221 in 2021. The number of victims of reported hate crimes also increased 41.9% from 2020 to 2021, and the number of suspects reported in hate crimes increased 41.2% from 2020 to 2021. Next slide, please. When we're looking at this data, it's important to understand the unit of counts. The event, when we're talking about an event, that is the global event that happens where the hate crime is involved. And within this event, there can be multiple offenses, multiple victims, and multiple offenders. You may see an event count that is lower where the victim and offense counts are higher, and that's because the event is capturing the totality of the event, and the offenses, victims, and offenders get their own unique counts. Next slide, please. In 2021, when we're looking at racial bias events, reported hate crime involving a racial bias overall increased 33.1% from 875 in 2020 to 1165 in 2021. Anti-Black or African American bias events rose from 456 in 2020 to 513 in 2021, an increase of 12.5%. Anti-Hispanic or Latino events increased as well from 152 to 197, which represents an increase of 29.6%. And anti-Asian bias events rose from 89 in 2020 to 247 in 2021, which represents an increase of 177.5%. Next slide, please. This slide is a depiction of the hate crimes and the racial bias events over the last 10 years. We wanted to provide this as some context so you can see how these different bias motivations for crimes have fluctuated over the years. And you can see, well, last year the biggest increase for anti-Asian was our largest increase, but the anti-Black and African American represent nearly half of all racially motivated crimes. Next slide, please. When we talk about the religion bias events, those rose 21.1% from 180 in 2020 to 218 in 2021. The anti-Jewish bias events rose from 115 to 152, which represents an increase of 32.2%, and anti-Catholic bias events rose from 6 to 16. Next slide, please. This is a display of the religious bias events over the last 10 years to also provide some context and how things have fluctuated over the years. Next slide, please. For sexual orientation bias events, those have increased 47.8% from 205 in 2020 to 303 in 2021. Anti-gay male bias event rose from 162 in 2020 to 211 in 2021, which represented an increase of 30.2%. And anti-homosexual bias events rose from 21 in 2020 to 61 in 2021. And anti-lesbian bias events also rose from 18 in 2020 to 27 in 2021. Next slide, please. And this is a 10-year overview, so you can see where this has fluctuated over time. Next slide, please. In terms of reported offenses, they increased 42.1% in 2021 from 1563 in 2020 to 2221 in 2021. Violent crime offenses increased 47.4%, and property crime offenses increased 27.7%. Next slide, please. When you take a look at the violent crimes in 2021, we can see that the largest increases we see are for aggravated assault and intimidation. And you can see how these numbers look over time. Next slide, please. And in looking at property crime, we can see that the largest increases for property crime were in larceny, theft, and destruction and vandalism. Next slide, please. Open Justice is our transparency website that's available to the public, where we host our data sets and our publications. On that site, you can download raw data files. You can download README, which are file descriptions, governing statutes, known data limitations, and any data dictionaries for each of the data sets that are downloadable. And you can also access annual reports. And this concludes my portion, so I'm going to hand this back over to Maheen.
Thank you so much, Allison, for your presentation. At this time, we'll be going through Q&A to see if there are any questions for any of today's presenters. I invite them all to join me on the screen. Thank you all for sending in the questions in the Q&A box. There are quite a few. We will try to do our best to get through as many as we can in the remaining time that we have. One of the major questions that I see over here is related to the recording of this presentation and the data that is being presented. This presentation is being recorded. We will be posting it online on the DOJ website. I'll also be sending an email after this presentation is over to all that registered with the link to the recording and the website. I will also share some of the resources that have been mentioned, such as the hate crimes report. And so please do keep a lookout for those. And so with that, let's go through the questions. So the first one here, and not in any particular order, just trying to get through them. This question is by Bambi. What type of investment is DOJ, I'm assuming, doing to empower transgender, non-conforming, and intersex people, other than collaborating with law enforcement, but directly supporting TGI people who are constantly targets of hate violence? Can CBOs apply for some funding to combat this through DOJ or the OAG? I could take the first stab at responding to this question. We are actively collaborating with other state agencies to make sure that there is funding and resources available for CBOs. One of the main ones that is currently available, and they're actively in their first cycle of providing funding, is the Stop the Hate program funding. This is run through the California Department of Social Services, so we're partnering with them, as well as the California State Libraries and the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, which is now called the Civil Rights Department. So we're working with them to make sure that this funding is dispersed to our communities, that we're letting communities know that this is active funding that is available. And this past cycle of funding, they had about $20 million that were distributed to organizations across the state that are working on hate crimes directly and working on issues for different communities. So that is something that we are going to continue to do at the DOJ. It's our commitment to make sure that there are resources that we could, if not provide directly, then uplift and work and collaborate with communities and other agencies to do so. So that's that one. I'll go on to the next. This is by Matthew. Does the DOJ make sure that hate crime is being defined by intersectional BIPOC? Would any of our presenters like to respond?
Yeah, I can jump in briefly. I mean, so, what's defined as a protected category is defined by the legislature. So in terms of the specifics of crime, it's tough because there are different types of laws, generally speaking. So, some laws are going to be sort of helped by regulation. I'm trying to think, in the firearms space, which I deal with a lot, there's the Department of Justice puts out a lot of, regulations about firearms. And defining certain terms and that kind of thing. Criminal law is very different. Criminal law is defined by the legislature, and we put out best practices and we put out different kinds of things about how to enforce. But the actual categories are defined by the legislature, and that doesn't mean that they're static and that they can never be changed. Just static in that we can't put out guidance that says also you should include this other group. I saw a question about intersectionality, certainly that kind of thing. Those are the types of things that can be taken into account when a prosecutor is looking at a crime and determining what group or perceived group that person belongs to, and looking at it's not exclusive to one. It doesn't have to be clearly as to one, but exactly we don't have the power to define any further beyond what the legislature has.
Thank you, Michael. There's a question here from Mariko that was sent over to us. Do you know if the increase in API events from 2020 to 2021 may be due to better education to report?
So no specific research has been done at this point in time to say whether it is because of, very pointed outreach efforts, and so more crime is being reported, or if there was an increase in hate itself. So we don't have a direct answer for that because that particular study hasn't been done yet.
Thank you, Allison. Kind of similar vein at the end of this question by Juan. It starts off, why are police departments not required to report hate crimes? Is there legislation pending to address this? After all, how can we know if hate crimes are underreported or if there are areas that must be addressed?
Law enforcement agencies are required to report hate crime to us monthly, and they are either required to report their what we call a positive count, so the actual reports that come in. And if they do not have a report, they are actually physically required to report what we call a zero report to us. So we are hearing from each law enforcement agency each month on whether or not there were hate crimes or were not hate crimes. So it is in statute.
But yeah, and when we talk about underreporting, I mean, we're talking about people not know, actually people who are victims of hate crimes or hate incidents who might not know that what just occurred to them was a crime, or might not think that something's going to be done about it, and so they're not reporting. So again, that is not certainly to lay blame on anybody, but exactly as Allison said, if the police become aware of it, they are mandated to report it to us. But some of what these last two questions are getting at is that, like other crimes, there are more thefts that occur in the state of California than we are aware of. Sometimes, somebody's bike is taken off somebody's porch and they don't think anything's going to come of it, so they don't report it to the police, or it's, something that they don't care about. So we know that, or it's reasonable to assume that, there is some number of thefts that are higher than the actual reported number of thefts that go directly from police to us. And likewise, we suspect it is the case with hate crimes. And, when I say suspect, exactly, there haven't been studies about it. And, these conversations on the ground, I've been at a number of the hate crimes roundtables, that's certainly, part of the conversation is that exactly people didn't necessarily know that what happened to them was a crime. And part of what we're doing, through presentations like this is trying to get this information out. And as somebody said, we're better off. We want to know. We're in a better place to, pitch the legislature and the governor on, putting the necessary resources when we know the scope of the problem. And so, those kinds of reportings are very helpful for us.
Thank you both. Question from Sunita. Can you please discuss how and where a victim can report a hate crime? Can organizations working with targeted groups report for the victim in case of language difficulties, perceived intimidation, etc.?
Sorry, I'm going to keep jumping in until somebody tells me not to. The short version is call the police, and that's your. When I say, so I mentioned there are a number of different law enforcement entities, in the state. There's local law enforcement, local police, sheriffs. There's statewide, which is us. There's federal, which is FBI, HSI, that kind of thing. But in general, if you believe, or if somebody that believes that there was a hate crime that occurred, or somebody's a victim of hate crime, start with calling the local police. And if it's something that needs to be elevated to statewide agency, the local police, will know or should know to do that. As far as, calling on behalf of somebody else, that's fine. I mean, you want to be, eventually at some point, the police are going to want to have a conversation with the person who was the victim of it, or witnessed it. And those people should all hopefully stick around and be able to provide information to the police and the necessary information to do any follow-up investigation. But in terms of the initial call, perfectly fine to call up the 911 dispatcher and say, hey, I'm here with my friend. My friend doesn't speak English. and I'm reporting on behalf of. Just convey, this just occurred. I'm here. I can translate. That kind of thing. Candidly, police are different resourced. The Los Angeles Police Department is very large. And because of that, they, have more translators available. They have, more people just by virtue of numbers that speak different languages. So they might be able to help. There are small police departments that are 10 people, and meaning 10 police officers. So if you call from there, it may be the case exactly that they just don't have somebody who speaks that language. They can call. They have access, many of them, to phone systems where they can relay the information and go through translation. But if you can be there to help, that's really up to them ultimately. So I don't want to say that's fine in every case. They may prefer to go through the teleconference system. But you should, the big picture takeaway is that you should not look at those as barriers to reporting. Call the police. If you believe you've been a victim of hate crime, and you can sort out the details and the technical hurdles in the interim.
Maheen, if I could kind of add to that, and there were a couple of other questions that sort of relate that were placed in the chat. Some police departments have non-emergency lines because there is a recognition that there is some hesitancy in certain communities contacting law enforcement. And so there are some agencies that have civilian operators and employees who will work with those who are reporting hate crimes. A lot of the community-based organizations that are working to provide resources and information to their communities are also avenues which can assist as a friendly face with reporting on hate crimes. One of the questions indicated, when were these listening sessions, or how could they be made available? The listening sessions that have taken place up to this point have been with our office and the mayors of the plan was the 13 largest cities in the state that we would sit down with community-based organizations, members of law enforcement, and leadership within those cities to hear from them about what's working, what's needed in those communities, and to see ways in which DOJ can be supportive of those efforts. And so Maheen may be able to provide some more information because those sessions were being coordinated through her office. But that is a way for us to receive information so that we can be more in tune to ways in which we can continue to assist in those efforts.
Thanks so much, Damon. There were a couple questions, I think, related to the report itself. One of them in particular asking about data on hate crimes against individuals with disabilities. And I was wondering, Allison, if you could respond to that, if there is data included in the report.
Yes, there is data included in the report on that. We just didn't have, due to time, can't include everything, but the report is comprehensive and all anti-bias motivation groups types are included in the report.
And that does that include, another question here, include hate crimes based on gender identity?
Yes.
Yes, I think we went over some of those as well. Great. Well, just going through. Let's see. I think some of these are repetitive. If you're asking for information on links, I will try to send those after this presentation. Same with any contact information. How does your department take cultural factors into consideration when it comes to addressing the underreporting of hate crimes? Is the question.
I think one of the ways is that through the guidance that's been issued, we have encouraged law enforcement agencies to develop cultural competency as it relates to the communities that they serve, so that they're aware of some of the issues that might implicate discourage communities from coming forward based on cultural differences. And so that is part of the guidance, is encouraging those agencies to develop and to support, whether it's through language or other programs that will really speak to eliminating some of the cultural barriers that might interfere with individuals' ability to report and feel comfortable coming forward with this information.
Thanks, Damon. And we have time for one more question before we have to close. The question here is from Wanda. If there was a crime that is speculated to be a hate crime, should the victim be encouraged to update their previous report?
I'm not sure if I.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, can you
No,
repeat
go ahead,
that
Allison.
again?
Yeah.
Was the question, are they required to update the report if new information comes in?
Yeah, and if they perceive it to be a hate crime.
Yeah, so we definitely have information that comes into us all of the time. Currently, we close out a statistical year so that we can publish on it. But in moving forward with our new incident-based reporting, there will be allowances for updates over time, meaning if different information came in a next statistical year. So those are kind of the things that we're looking towards in improving the data collection and quality moving forward.
That's also part of why in the report, there's also a section on prosecutorial data, and some of that information also will not track with the annual reported data, because a prosecution could span multiple years in which the data is being reported. And so to that point, if additional details are reported, in subsequent periods, of reporting, it may not necessarily correlate to the actions that are being taken by local law enforcement.
Thank you so much. And just this one final question that I see here before I wrap. What do you think about reporting hate crimes not to government agencies such as Stop the Hate, AAJC? Will that data be collected? I think Allison talked about this a little bit, and you can jump in. The data that is collected for the sake of our reporting is through the local law enforcement agencies, so it will have to be reported to them in order for us to collect that. Is it correct?
That is correct.
Great, thank you. So we will not be able to, unfortunately, take any more questions. There are so many great ones that I wish we were able to answer. I will be sending an email afterward with resources and the links that hopefully can answer some of your questions. If not, you can feel free to respond to our email address, care@doj.ca.gov, in case you have more questions. I would like to really thank you all for joining us today for our Demystifying the DOJ presentation on hate crimes. We hope that this presentation was informative to you and useful. Please do keep in contact with us at the email address that I just mentioned, care@doj.ca.gov. We're planning to do these presentations quarterly and also recording them to make sure that they are accessible online on our website. Our website is oag.ca.gov/care, CARE. You can also find last quarter's presentation on our DOJ Victim Services Unit on the website if you're interested in watching it. And if you're watching this presentation live right now, then please do be on the lookout for that email that I mentioned with the resources. And we'll try to also see if we can post those online when we post this recording. Please also keep an eye out for information on next quarter's presentation topic and date, and we hope you can join us then. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.